they could put the house lights up a bit so we can see the wonderful people who bothered to come and listen to us.
See some faces.
I want to see you.
How about that video? Very, very moving and very inspiring. We're going to talk about voting and many things during this conversation. We're excited to be joined by Rhett, Butler, founder and CEO of Mongabay, which is a nonprofit news organization that covers the intersection of nature and people via a network of 900 journalists operating in about 80 countries. And we'll learn a little bit how they met. So let's do this. You look fabulous. It's been 7 years, and when we talked 7 years ago, you talked about how all those years in the rainforest infused you with a sense of great spiritual power and connection. And I think that spiritual power is one reason why we have more than 1,000 people here with us.
Who we still cannot see.
I can see some of them. How is your spirit right now, and what are you feeling connected to in this moment?
At this moment, well, I'm sorry, but if I could see everyone, I'd feel connected to the audience. I can't see them.
There we go, we got some. There we go. You can see those right there.
Anyway, well, I always feel connected, when I come up to give a talk. I sort of open my heart up so that the talks I give are basically the same, but they're different depending on who I'm talking to. And that can only happen if you kind of open yourself to the feeling in the room.
Okay, so now you're feeling the people you can see, and you do this all the time. You were in Miami recently, in Atlanta, speaking to thousands of people. That must be... How do you keep recharged doing that all the time?
Because I care about the future, because I care passionately about the environment and wild animals, biodiversity, because I've got grandchildren, and probably at least 2 of them will soon have their own children, because I care about children, but most of all, it's the future of this planet. And do we want to be the one species who comes onto the planet and destroys it?
Right, in almost a couple of generations, we're the only species that kind of destroys our own home with this intellectual brain that we think is so clever. So why is it that if we're so clever, why are we destroying our own home?
Because we've lost the connection between the clever brain and the human heart, which is love and compassion. And we're overcome with the divide between the haves and the have-nots is getting wider and wider. And the few people who have unsustainable lifestyles are doing a tremendous amount to destroy the environment. But then on the other hand, so is poverty. Poverty isn't talked about enough. But the really poor people in the rural areas, they destroy the planet simply to survive, cutting down the trees to make money from charcoal or timber in Africa, or to make more land to grow food for their growing families. And in the urban areas, they buy the cheapest junk food because it's all they can afford. They can't afford, as we 3 can, to ask, where did it come from? How was it made? Did it harm the environment? Was it cruel to animals like factory farms? Is it cheap because of unfair wages? They have to buy the cheapest to survive.
Poor people do desperate and damaging things, and affluence, there's another kind of impact. You write and talk a lot about hope. You have a hope cast that I've listened to. It's very good. It was what you did when you were in your COVID at home, isolated and locked down during COVID. And I have a complicated relationship with the word hope, and you wrote a book about it. You wrote that hope is misunderstood. It is often seen as passive. So what is hope? Is it a feeling? Is it a skill? And how do you access it?
Well, to me, if we lose hope, we're doomed, because if everybody loses hope, particularly young people, then if you lose hope, what's the point of doing anything? if you don't hope that what you do will make a difference.
Drink and be merry, tomorrow we die.
Yes, tomorrow we die.
Yeah.
And then the wealthy who don't really care because they only care about the moment will carry on and as they are doing. But, people come to me and they say, well, I'm really depressed. What can I do? I'm just one person. The world's in a mess. And I say, stop thinking that you can change the world. Think about where you are in your own community. What do you care about there? Can you try and do something about that? Maybe you care about litter. Maybe you care about people in the street, homelessness, whatever you care about. See if you can find something to do about that problem. And then you'll find you can succeed, and that'll make you feel good, and you want to do more. And then you can understand around the world there's other people just like you doing what you're doing, and then you get a feeling of, yes, we can.
We're joined today by Rhett Butler, producer and founder of Mongabay, a news site with 900 journalists covering the intersection of nature and people. And Rhett, I'd like to hear from you. How did you meet Jane, and how did you get connected?
It was kind of a funny story. So I opened my email one day, and I had this message, and it said, from Jane Goodall, and then it said, shh, this is the real Jane Goodall. I'm a big fan of Mongabay. I'm coming to San Francisco. Would you like to meet up?
And at this point, I'd like to say that this man sitting here, what he has created with his growing team around the world, we know we're going through dark places in the planet today, and we need to expose those places. We also need to share the good things that are being done, the hopeful things. And that's what you do with Mongabay. And I tell everybody, if you really want to know the truth about a particular issue, go to Mongabay. Congratulations.
So you get this email, and do you think it's like some scam? What do you do?
Well, there were some references to, to mutual people and things like that. So I suspected that it was true. And there was an event coming up, Wildlife Conservation Network, where Jane was speaking. So there was that reference point as well. And so, when she invited me to the hotel where she was staying, I figured it was legitimate. And so, took that risk.
Yeah. So, okay. So you got an email from an icon saying, come to my hotel and drink whiskey with me? Is that like...
Yes.
Do you write these emails often?
No.
It's only very special ones. So, there's a lot. Environmental journalism can be dark, and there's a real problem with the doom narrative, and it's sort of. So, what are some positive stories about climate and nature that Mongabay has covered? Because you cover the darkness and you also cover the light.
Yeah. Well, I think it's challenging because there is so much doomerism and bad news in the world. You really have to make an effort to dig out those positive stories. And so, one of the big stories is there are places where recovery has happened. So you've had places like Costa Rica where you've had large-scale conversion of forests that are now coming back from. So you went from like a 23% forest cover to 50% forest cover. There's also this movement to recognize indigenous peoples and local communities and the conservation outcomes that have been achieved on their lands. And so putting local communities at the center of conservation efforts has had these really wonderful impacts. And so that's kind of been a transformation, I would say, in the past decade where that's been recognized. And then we're here in Silicon Valley, the emergence of technology that gives us a clearer picture of what's happening in the world and telling us what's working and what's not working. And so that's also been a very positive development. There's a lot out there, but you do have to dig for it.
Right, and sometimes marine protected areas are one of the positive areas. Bill McKibben recently wrote about a very positive story about a quiet silent solar revolution in Africa, where distributed solar is being deployed. It's not showing up in government statistics, and it's reaching people who need it the most because they have unreliable energy. They can't afford it. And he wrote about, was citing some Bloomberg statistics that there's solar deployment. We don't often see this in the headlines, doesn't show up in statistics, and it's really happening. Jane, what are some positive stories? Because you travel everywhere and talk to so many people. What are some positive stories that you've seen recently?
Well, it's amazing. I mean, I do travel all over the world, just about, and everywhere, and just about every culture, there are people, more and more people, passionate about the environment. I think that's one very positive bit of news, that more and more people understand, more and more people want to do something about the climate. And, you know, you can, well, I've got this youth program, and the youth are in this program, they're passionate about making the world better, and they care, and they act. It's all about taking action. There's about 1,500 groups across mainland China, for example. So this understanding of what we're doing to the planet is growing, and that in itself is good news. In 1960, Gombe National Park, where I studied the chimps, was part of the Great Equatorial Forest Belt. And by the end of the 1980s, it was a tiny island of forest. All around were bare hills. And that's what I was saying. The people were cutting down the forest to survive. And that's when it hit me that we need to help these people find a way of making a living without destroying the environment. And we started this program, Tukari. And it's very holistic, no time to go into it now, but it includes not just restoring fertility to overused farmland without chemicals, and growing more food on that newly restored land, but scholarships to give girls a chance of secondary education because they're the mothers affecting their children, microcredit, which I feel is tremendously important, so that poor villagers can take out a tiny loan to start their own small, environmentally sustainable business. And then when they pay back, and it's over 90% that do pay back in our Tukari program, they're proud. It's mine. I did it. Whereas a grant, they'll use it up and want more.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks to Dr. Mohammed Yunus for that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, right.
Yes.
I remember, when he spoke at the Commonwealth Club, he said, why do banks make loans to people who have money? They're not the ones who need money. You need to make loans to people who don't have money.
And by the way, that program is in 6 other African countries now. Mm-hmm. So it's raising people out of poverty. And no more bare hills. The trees have come back.
So the nature of resilience. Well, one of the key areas in all these things we're talking about, food, deforestation, palm oil, the world's most produced vegetable oil. It's used in lipstick, cookies, laundry detergent. It's all over the grocery store. It's everywhere. Also a huge driver of biodiversity loss and destruction of rainforests. The World Wildlife Fund publishes a scorecard of companies producing palm oil responsibly. Candy makers Hershey and Mars leading the way. Smucker Jams, Taco Bell, KFC, and Pizza Hut lagging behind. So are we making progress? Because we talked about this 7 years ago. You said we're making progress. Are we making progress on palm oil?
I'd like to turn that to Rhett, because you've done a lot on palm oil.
Yeah, palm oil's been something that we've covered for a long time. We've probably produced thousands of stories, and it's the picture's getting a lot better. So back in the 2000s, there was just large-scale conversion of forests, especially in Malaysia and Indonesia, for oil palm plantations. And there's been this dramatic collapse in conversion of natural forests across both those countries since about 2016. In terms of conversion for palm oil. So the story has changed radically in a very positive direction, and a lot of that is because of pressure, or I guess you could say shame. So,
is it consumer pressure, policy, both?
So it's pressure on the big companies, which comes from a variety of places, but the largest palm oil trader in the world is a company called Wilmar. And they adopted this zero deforestation commitment in about 2012 or 2013. And the rumor is the reason that happened was the CEO's daughter came home and said, "Dad, why are you killing the orangutans?" So, very powerful message, but it's groups like, it's activist groups, Greenpeace and Global Witness who are reporting on these abuses, and they're reaching people who then can influence these key decision makers. And, governments tend to lag, and so you have this pressure on the companies, but the companies don't want to be the only actors, and so, you get government regulation coming in, which ends up moving more of the market. Because you might have 20% of the market of the players who start to implement these zero deforestation policies, but there's still a lot of damage being done by sort of the rest of the market, and so that's where regulation comes in because it brings everyone along.
And you talk about this child coming and saying to her father, "Why are you destroying the planet?" That's the great thing about growing this youth program, because the mothers and fathers of all these children in our programs, some of their parents are politicians, and some of their parents are teachers, and so these young people are influencing older generations, and they're going to grow up to be the next decision makers.
Absolutely. It's something that makes me optimistic for the future.
Yeah, me too. My biggest reason for hope.
And
is
the
the youth.
number
And I
of-
know, thanks to you, there's a lot of young people here who wouldn't be here if Rhett hadn't bought your seats. So,
Yes. And the number of, usually it's a daughter, by the way, who speaks to a powerful dad. There's a famous story in Silicon Valley, John Doerr, big venture capitalist, similar thing, "Dad, you caused this, what are you doing about it?" It's often the daughters reaching their dads. Jane, a couple of years ago, you co-wrote the book with Douglas Adams, The Book of Hope, and you wrote about your 4 reasons for hope, one of which is the power of young people, as well as the human spirit, and the resilience of nature, which we've talked about, and the amazing human intellect. But let's talk about young people. A lot of young people are scared, and they're angry. And U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, in the recent book, The Anxious Generation, have talked about young people think about coming out of COVID, looking at climate, et cetera. There's a real mental health crisis among U.S. youth. I don't know if that's international. So what do you say to young people who are scared and worried about what naturally they're going to live in longer than you and I will?
it's very simple. I tell them to join Roots and Shoots, our youth program, because I've seen, I don't think there's a single child, and we are kindergarten through university, who doesn't join Roots and Shoots, take an active role in it, and feel hopeful about the future. Hundreds of them have told me, "I feel completely different now. I feel there is hope for the future." Because the reason it's called Roots and Shoots is because if you think of a big tree, you love trees, I know. You probably love trees. Many people out there. Well, think of your favorite tree. It probably began with a little seed, and when it started to grow, there'd be little roots and a little shoot. And if you picked it up, it would seem so weak and powerless, and yet there's a life force, a magic in that seed, so that those little roots to reach the water can work through rocks and eventually push them aside. And that little shoot to reach the sun can work through a brick wall and eventually knock it down. So we see the young people as the roots and the shoots, and all the problems are the rocks and the walls, and they will break through. So Roots and Shoots, and I hope that some of you are here, who don't know about Roots and Shoots. The program means that you choose yourself. We don't tell you what to do, but as a group you choose 3 projects, one to help people, one to help animals, one to help the environment. And then you discuss what can we do to improve this in our community, and roll up our sleeves and take action. Or you might want to help immigrants, and you might want to help raise money for one cause or another. It doesn't matter what you decide to do. But if it's a problem that concerns you, you will work very hard to put it right. And you will feel great when you know that around the world there are other people, other young people doing the same sort of thing. So if young people are depressed, tell them, of course you're depressed. We know that things are not good. But I've lived 90 years and I've seen bad times and I've seen us get over them. And somehow this indomitable spirit within us will get us through this, along with this intellect, which we have not used wisely. But we are beginning, aren't we, Rhett? I mean, people are coming up with more and more ways of slowing down climate change and loss of biodiversity, the sort of programs you alluded to. And they are beginning to make a difference. Some of them are technological, like these, not sure about these mechanical trees and things, but, maybe. But, things like permaculture. And so important, and you will agree with me, is moving to a plant-based diet. And that's why I take... This is piglet, and this is cow. And what I want to say to you, it's not just that the huge areas of land that are cleared to grow food for them. It's not just that particularly cows, the food goes in here and comes out the other end, and that's methane gas, and that's another vicious greenhouse gas that's, affecting climate change. But just think, each one of these animals is an individual. We talk about cows, but this is an individual cow, and this is an individual pig. And I just met a pig called Picasso, not Picasso, Picasso. Picasso loves to paint. Her paintings are selling for over $5,000. Her biggest painting sold for $25,000. And she lives in Cape Town, and she watched a person who rescued her from a factory farm, who's an artist, who set up an easel and gave Picasso a brush in her mouth, and she started to paint. She loves it. As soon as she sees the bucket with paints, she comes running out, and she even dips the brush in different colors to make her marks. And the only thing she's really been taught is at the end, she'll dip her snout in red paint and make her snout mark.
So there's an initiative north of San Francisco in an agricultural region talking about changing the food system. It's called Measure J, and it intends to ban basically factory farms. And Jane, there are signs all over the county who are there are signs, judging by the number of signs all over that county, it's no, 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 because of the potential jobs loss. Ranchers are against it. It seems like the food system is so big and so powerful. Yes, okay, if I eat a plant-based diet, but the number of vegetarians is not growing in this country. It's just not. It's around 3%. Is for all the, climatarian and alternative proteins, vegetarian, meat. Maybe it's more chicken, less beef. So how do we change such a big food system, especially when something gets on the ballot and there's this big backlash saying it's going to take away jobs, it's going to hurt ranchers? I don't know what it's...
Do you want to answer that, or both of us?
Well, I think I'd point back to you because you speak so well about compassion and empathy for animals, and so that's probably
that's compassion and empathy for animals is changing people. There's no question. And the other thing, which is positive, I've become a vegan because I've understood the horrors that go on in dairy farming and
separating young newborns from
horrible.
their parents.
And the conditions that the mothers are kept in is absolutely horrible.
Right.
And the same with laying chickens. It's absolutely, they're in a tiny space like this, and their egg drops through a wire bottom. And I know chickens, and we have chickens in Africa. They have personalities. They're all different, very different. We have a cockerel called Tyson because he attacks you every time you appear. But anyway, so that's one side of it. But I think probably right now, I don't know if you agree with me, Rhett, but more powerful is the devastating effect on the environment and the CO2 emissions, which come from the the whole of agricultural farming, actually. And then when you realize the difference when you get to permaculture and you get to agroforestry, and everybody says you can't feed more people like that, but it actually, you can grow more food that way. And we don't need genetically modified food. And you add to that because you can.
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize that about 80% of deforestation in the Amazon, which is the world's largest rainforest, is driven by cattle ranching.
Yeah.
So it has this huge impact, not only on the animals, but also on their habitat, climate, rainfall, all these things. So it's, it's a much bigger issue.
And the other positive thing, when I first became vegan, the food was revolting. I mean, it was just, you got a wilted lettuce leaf or a bit of half-cooked asparagus or something, but now you can't tell the difference.
There's also Rhett, you've covered some positive news stories. There's deforestation in Indonesia. There's also some positive things happening there with a sort of debt for nature swaps, where some of the money that Indonesia owes the U.S. federal government, $35 million, is going to be forgiven and used towards safeguarding reefs in eastern Indonesia over the next decade. So talk to us about that in terms of debt for nature, using money, forgiving sovereign debt, really, which is a kind of fairly new thing, to fund climate projects in Indonesia and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, so this is part of a broader trend where there are new financial instruments that are available that are going into supporting conservation and also restoration. So it's really important, and there's a growing recognition of the role that nature plays in addressing many of our planetary challenges, whether it's climate change, the availability of water, so these ecosystem services. And so because a lot of decision-making in the world is based around finances or economics, in order to reach certain audiences, you need to speak that language. So while some people would be opposed to the idea of financializing nature, to engage government people or the UN or whatever, sometimes you need to put a value on things and just understand that that's sort of like the lowest level value. There's also the intrinsic value and everything else, but you need sort of this starting point, speaking a language that those types of decision makers use.
Right, powerful new tools, financial innovation. Jane Goodall, early in his administration, President Biden committed to setting aside 30% of lands and water in the United States by 2030. This 30 by 30 initiative actually has its roots in E.O. Wilson, saying we put aside half. They kind of said, let's try 30. It's happening internationally. Several states, California has committed to these activities, 30% of land, 30% of water. Critics have said the U.S. plan is too inclusive of activities like ranching, logging, farming. How are you feeling about our progress toward 30 by 30? Are we getting there?
Well, I'm always being asked questions that I'm not competent to answer. Like, okay, there are people suffering in poverty, there are people starving, we need to feed them, we've got to find food to feed them, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, and all these things lead to destruction of nature. So how do we balance the saving of the environment and the needs of people? Well, I don't know if it's for an economist or what it's for, but I can't just come up with an answer. Maybe AI can, I don't know. But anyway, so basically what I have to say is, if we cannot solve it, if we cannot find ways to protect the environment for the future, then nobody should have any children because there won't be a future. We've got to understand that. We've got to take action now. And if we all take action now, even with our own individual actions, the way we can influence people, then we can, I won't say change climate change, we can slow it down and slow down loss of biodiversity because the two are intertwined, right?
You mentioned you have a great-grandchild on the way. If you were young today, how would you approach thinking of having children? Because some young couples are saying they're choosing not to. Fertility rates are dropping.
Well, I can't, that would have to be an individual choice. And, but the answer is, you know, if you're thinking about having a child, get involved in programs to protect the environment for your child's future.
If you're going to do it, make a world for them. Rhett, your thoughts on 30 by 30? You know, are we making progress? This idea that we need to set aside some areas and sort of leave them alone, but it might have implications for poor people who live and depend on those lands.
Yeah, I mean, so the key thing about 30 by 30 is it's not 30% in national parks. It's much more inclusive. So it's about building constituency around protecting nature. So that includes ranches. It includes indigenous lands. It includes like a bunch of different interventions. So the term for it is OECMs, for other effective conservation measures. So, you know, a wonky conservation term, but you're not going to get 30% of the world off limits, you know, on that time frame. So it's really about being pragmatic and looking for opportunities and sort of reaching across the political spectrum to find commonalities where people can agree we need to protect nature for our children and future generations, but we can do it in ways that are not necessarily excluding people from these seascapes and landscapes.
Right, that can't rope it off. No, and also leveraging private landowners, right? Because we're not going to get it all done by public lands. Rhett, plastics are a problem. Combination of cheap fossil fuels resulting in environmental harm. About 175 countries have been working to develop a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, hoping to wrap up negotiations this year. Mongabay's published a lot of stories on plastics, microplastics hurting human health, bioplastics that are supposedly compostable. How are you feeling on the progress we're making on the vast plastic problem?
I mean, I think progress is being made. There's certainly a lot more awareness. I don't think progress is fast enough. My issue with plastic has always been like, why do we need to, you know, put a banana in a plastic bag in the last 10,000 years? I mean, it makes no sense to me. And why are we holding Coca-Cola and Pepsi, the companies that are producing all this plastic, you know, holding their feet to the fire about developing real solutions? Because again, it's a perishable product. It doesn't need to last 10,000 years. And so I feel like there's not enough pressure on those companies. I mean, that's changing, but it feels like progress is very slow. And then the other side, if you're looking at sort of like the economic part of the equation, is that the fossil fuel industry is building out a lot of capacity for plastic. So the expectation is that you know, demand is going to continue to grow for these products, even if we see a reduction in demand for oil itself. So I guess I would say that I'm glad there's more awareness. I'm glad there's more pressure, but it doesn't feel like we're moving quickly enough to actually address this problem.
Right, and that's one sort of multilateral, international way of tackling plastics. Jane, you know, people touch plastics all the time. I think it's one thing where you can't go to the grocery store, at least in the U.S. these days, without vegetables wrapped in plastic and things in plastic. And I feel bad. It makes me feel bad knowing about not only where that plastic is going to go, but through my education doing this radio show, I know that plastic was made in someone's neighborhood that I don't know and I don't see, and it caused pollution. So it's the production of that plastic as well as after I use that plastic, and I feel overwhelmed, and I guess I feel dirty and bad when I touch plastic. And I don't know that you can say you're the advocate of individual action and, you know, what every choice decisions we make every day matters. But I feel overwhelmed by plastic and feel like, I feel resigned. How do you cope with that resignation, or that just like it's everywhere, it's so big, you can't avoid plastic? Maybe there's not plastic in the grocery stores where you shop.
Well, first of all, the Roots and Shoots programs around the world, one of their things is beach cleanups, collecting plastic. Don't you think there should be a way of stopping plastic when there's a flood washing into the ocean, to stop the rivers flooding it out? Because that's where most of it comes from. In the ocean. I read the other day a story, I'm sure it's in Mongabay, about somebody who's got this idea of going out, and they're actually starting it, tackling this, what's it called, this huge ocean...
Gyres.
Yes. Do you know about that program?
Yeah.
You must
Like
do.
the plastiki where they collect the plastic.
Yeah, well, tell them about it.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, they're collecting the plastic in the ocean and the environment, but I think I think that's nice, but it's still not addressing the source of the problem. I mean, you need to clean it up.
No,
but
you need both.
yeah. And so that's, these are important initiatives, but
Yeah.
I would really focus on the
Well,
source.
so would I, but
Yeah.
the fact they say within 5 years they can clean up that huge passion. They've got 2 boats, and they're coming back now with their results from their 2 years out there.
They're very big, so 2 years feels ambitious.
And some of those
but
things haven't panned out quite as they
yeah,
promised.
I think there's 5 major gyres, so it's,
Yeah.
I mean, I like the idea, but I think the scale is
Well,
quite
maybe
low.
we can scale that up.
Yeah.
And at the other end, I mean, you always have to do both, don't you? It's like wildlife trafficking. We need to catch the poachers, and we need to catch the kingpins, but we also need to tackle the demand.
Mm-hmm.
It's always both.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. We talk a lot about how individual action can connect to systemic change. Rhett talked earlier about people who are powerful in companies receiving pressure from the outside or pressure from inside the family. Jane, you believe that change happens from inside. That there's in the climate conversation, there's lots of naming and shaming, right? Judging people. Oh, you ate a hamburger. Oh, you flew on an airplane. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Not so sure I've done that and learned the hard way that people in my life that doesn't work. People resent that. And so how do you, if change needs to happen from the inside, how can you ignite that internal change?
Well, when I meet people who I think, I personally think have got the wrong idea, that they like climate change deniers and things like that. I have found, and I think I was always made this way, that it's no good pointing fingers and being angry and making them feel bad, or especially in front of their peers, because they're not going to listen. They're going to be angry. But so instead of battling with their head and telling them why they're wrong and why what they're doing is affecting this, that, and the other, you've got to reach the heart. And the only way I know how to reach the heart is by telling stories. And in order to tell a story to a powerful CEO or government official, you've got to know a little bit about them to find the right story. And if you find the right story, you may not actually know at the time that you did reach the heart, but sometimes you learn afterwards that that person changed because of that story.
And you also reach, you transcend a lot of the political and tribal boundaries that we have in our culture today. And you also talk with not just deniers, because that's a really small part, it's less than 10% at least of America, but you do talk with Republicans who might have a different view, who might not deny climate change, but not think it's a big deal, or the markets will solve it, or technology will solve it. So how do you reach those kinds of people? Tell about your conversations with Republicans, because so few environmentalists talk across divides these days.
Well, this year there have been 48 countries with major elections. And of course, the people in power in politics have a role to play in what we do to tackle climate change and all the other dark problems we face today. And so I've been going around the world saying, so many people are fed up with politics. And they don't care particularly about any of it. They don't even bother to read about the candidates. They just don't care. So they don't vote. And the more and more people who don't vote, then the harder it will be to vote for those people who care the most about your future, which is why my great friend Jeff Horowitz, who's actually the reason I'm here today, along with Rhett, right? Rhett and Jeff Horowitz. So this sign, and I know many people are listening and can't see, so you can read out the sign, Greg.
Votefornature.com, yeah.
So vote for nature. Your vote matters. This is the important thing. Every single vote matters. And you need to register, and you need to vote for the person you believe will be most likely to care about nature and the future of the planet.
There's And there's a project called the Environmental Voter Project, which uses big data to find out that a lot of environmentalists don't vote. A lot of people who buy Patagonia, REI, it's the lifestyle, et cetera, they don't actually vote, which is quite striking. Rhett Butler,
All these young people up here, old enough to vote, you're all going to vote, right?
Rhett Butler, this is the year where more people will vote or cast a ballot in the world than ever before. Elections have happened in India, Mexico, elsewhere. Some have been the same party, state, so there's sort of continuity in policy. Sometimes there's been a change in power, powers changed hands. So what have you seen from a climate lens in the elections that have happened so far?
Oof, that's a big question. I think it really just depends on the country. It's pretty diverse.
Mexico saw a climate scientist elected. People thought, like, maybe that's a change?
It's a change, yeah. We have to see, like, what happens there, because there have been, she's not president. I mean, she's becoming
walking
president.
a line with a
We'll see.
state
Yeah,
oil company.
There's an incumbent who has different viewpoints, so I think we have to see how that plays out.
And Brazil.
Brazil was last year, or well, 2 years ago, I guess, and that's been a huge change. So deforestation had been surging for the past, it had been trending upwards, but then it surged with the previous president. The new president came in, and deforestation's fallen by more than 50%. So more than. So what does that mean? That's more than 2,000 square miles less deforestation in the first year and a half-ish compared to the previous president. And that has real implications for climate, for biodiversity, for the entire structure of the Amazon rainforest ecosystem. So really important. And so if you want to get that systemic change, you have to influence people at the top. Individual decision making is important, but you can only move the needle so far. And so it's your campaign is extremely important.
And it's, again, individuals who are voting. So
yeah, exactly.
Everybody has a role to play in getting the right people at the top.
So, Jane, I've heard you say that when you were growing up, you were encouraged by adults in your life to set your dreams on things that you could accomplish as a girl. The U.S. may finally elect a woman president in about 6 weeks. We don't know. As an iconic woman who has done so much for women in science, what do you think about this particular moment?
Well, all I know is that when I was very young, women wouldn't have dreamed really of doing what women are doing today. We still have further to go, but in some countries it's terrible, as we know, in Afghanistan and so on. But women all around much of the world have a much stronger say in what goes on in their country, in their family. And I just was fortunate in having an amazing mother. And when I dreamed of going to Africa when I was 10, because I was in love with Tarzan, and he went and married the wrong Jane. And so everybody laughed at me except my mother. She said, if you want to do something like this, then you've got to work really hard, take advantage of every opportunity. If you don't give up, hopefully you find a way. And many women have said to me, that encouraged me to do what I've done. And so, women now have as much opportunity to rise to the top as men do in some countries, like the US.
Did you find it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did you find Tarzan?
What?
Did you find a Tarzan when you went?
Well, I knew there wasn't a Tarzan. My imagined Tarzan, I could never have met anybody like that.
Rhett, a lot of Mongabay's news coverage of nature and science, covers on dealing with a lot of environmental challenges that result from the actions of wealthier countries and nations, people who are listening to us now. What have you found that helps rich Americans, for example, understand the impact of their actions on people they don't know and places they don't go?
Well, it's really about making that connection. So as Jane was talking about storytelling, you need to do that storytelling. So if you're just throwing out statistics, like no one remembers that 10,000 square kilometers of rainforest was cleared last year in the Amazon. They remember the stories around that. So the community that fought back and chased the oil company out and then restored the land. And so it is really about creating that connection. And so thinking about the products you consume, how they link back to things in the world. So the coffee you're buying, or the the Oreo cookies, like where's that palm oil coming from? And it's amazing calling like that customer support line at a big company. They get a few calls that actually can have a big impact. So it is creating that connection that is really important. The other thing that is really relevant and ties in kind of with voting is the whole idea of news avoidance. So a lot of people are just bummed out by reading the news because it's so depressing. But there are types of news that people still read even if they are news avoiders. Positive news and solutions news. And so it's an opportunity to engage people. And then if you look at the political breakdown of news avoidance, people who are on the right avoid very different types of news than people on the left. So among news avoiders on the right, something like 70% avoid climate and environment news. So if you want to engage those audiences, you need to tell those climate stories through types of news they don't avoid. So finance, economics, health, security. And so you may need to think about reaching audiences where they're at and conveying the importance of protecting the Amazon from an economic standpoint or from a health standpoint.
Using their language, right? There's a lot of people on the left use the word planet. You don't hear people on the right saying planet. They say economy, right? Just a lot of it's listening and using the language. You yourself are an environmental journalist, and you don't read environmental news.
Well, I read Mongabay, of course, but
yeah,
no, I have a rich diet of different news sources, but I'm not a major consumer of just straight environmental news.
Because it bums you out?
No, because I need to know what other people are talking about, and there's only so many hours in the day, so I need to sort of understand what's happening in the world that may be outside the environmental realm. Because again, you need to understand the language and what people are talking about. What is that, in finance, economics, wherever it is.
So you don't want to be too deep into the environmental bubble. You got to kind of keep balanced in your information diet.
Yeah, absolutely, and just understanding like what you need to look for to determine whether a source is credible or not. Do they make corrections? Do they talk about how they source information and things like that? So it's really important, especially as we have more and more, as AI is rising, you're going to get more and more sort of garbage out there.
We've been talking about the power of elections, and Jane, last year a majority of Ecuadorians did something remarkable. They voted to ban oil operations in part of the Amazon rainforest and leave more than $1 billion worth of oil in the ground in Yasuni National Park. The government has reportedly started to shut down oil drilling. There's some talk that the president might try to slow walk that. But what do you make of this? The people of Ecuador voting, we've been talking about the power of elections, to leave oil in the ground, which will mean less money for indigenous people and others to protect the Amazon.
Because the indigenous people understand that far more important than anything else is the environment. Because people they understand perfectly well that we humans are part of the environment. And not only are we part of it, but we depend on it. We depend on it for food, for water, for clothing, for just about everything. But what we're depending on is healthy ecosystems. And I see an ecosystem as like a beautiful tapestry, and all the different complex intertwining of plant and animal species make up this tapestry. And every time a species goes from that particular environment, you pull a thread from the tapestry until it hangs in tatters, and the ecosystem will collapse. And that's happening around the world. And shouldn't we at this point say how absurd that the environment has become a political topic? It's all of our environment. It's our future. What we should be doing is not fighting over it, but by getting together from both sides, red, white, blue, yellow, whatever color the party is, and trying to use this intellect, which makes us more different from the other animals than anything else. We've lost wisdom, but we've got this intellect. Shouldn't we all be getting together and working out ways of solving how to feed the world, how to keep people in a good living condition, and protect the environment? If we all got together, instead of this ridiculous partisan separation, what's going on is crazy.
Speaking of the human intellect, we're here in San Francisco, which is the center of AI, trying to match this human intellect with machines. Rhett, there's a lot of concern about the energy impact of AI. It takes massive, mind-boggling amounts of energy to build these large language models that are kind of really derailing some, Microsoft and Google energy commitments. There's also another side, some upside to AI that could really help. So how do you see the energy and climate impacts of AI?
That's a big question. I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. I do think that AI can be quite valuable for advancing progress on climate change, making
mapping
energy more
forests,
efficient,
measuring carbon.
mapping forests. That's it. There are also big downsides. One of which is just the energy consumption. So I think, I'm not an expert in this, but I would say that the jury is still very much out on this front. But there is huge potential for more efficient use or distillation of data into actionable information, which used properly can transform energy systems and our understanding of how the planet works.
Now, how do we ensure it's used properly and doesn't turn countries into police states?
That's a big question, isn't it? Yeah, because the policy ahead of the technology. Policy often lags technology. It did with the internet. It did with social media. They say they're trying to learn from those two previous mistakes and get it right this time. I don't know. Bet on Washington to do that. Jane, last year Apple TV Plus released a series called Jane, featuring a young girl who considers you her hero and is similarly passionate about nature and wildlife conservation. And the show highlights ways young people can get involved in these things in their own life. So what was it like working on a show about yourself?
Well, I didn't work on it at all.
What's it like watching?
It was nothing to do with me.
Have you watched it?
I've watched one episode.
Yeah.
I'm too busy doing what I do and growing roots and shoots to watch other people.
But that will introduce you to potentially a whole new generation. It must be, inspiring to hear that.
Yeah, well, I know it's done good.
Mm-hmm.
The young children love watching it, and it does involve them in projects to protect nature. So it's doing good. But I don't have time to sit and watch somebody.
Always on the move.
You already know your story.
Our culture, you're 90, and you've talked about your final chapter and what's the great beyond. Our culture avoids talking about death, yet death is integral part of nature, part of indigenous cultures who have sorts of rituals around it. So, as you look at the next decade, and I hope we sit here when you're 100, how do you think about your next chapter?
Well, I was asked this question once in an audience much bigger than this, and this woman said something about what was my next adventure? And so I thought, this was about 4 years ago. So I thought, what is my next adventure? And I thought for a moment, and I said, dying. And it was kind of deathly harsh, and then a few titters. And I said, well, when you die, there's either nothing, it's the end, or there's something. And things have happened to me in my life that I feel there is something. And if there is, I can't think of a greater adventure than dying. So before most anybody in this audience, I'll find out. I'll try and let you know.
It's something that, yeah, I mean, I think it's life-affirming to think we're in these temporary bodies. Rhett, do you think about it?
I mean, I'm comfortable with the idea of dying. I'm not something I'm afraid of, but I think, I mean, maybe I'll take this in a more morose direction, I guess. One of the things I would say is that there are a lot of environmental defenders who are putting their lives on the line every day who are, getting killed or, harassed or imprisoned. Yeah. And I think, this is a real problem. It's environmental journalists, it's indigenous leaders, it's activists, and it's something that doesn't seem to be getting a lot better. It's consistently high, and so I think it's something that we need to be aware of, that there are people on the front lines who are putting their lives on the line for our collective well-being.
And you haven't answered his question. What do you think about it?
Oh, about dying? Or?
Yes, about dying.
Well, I keep my affairs in order, so if it happens,
When you go on a trip,
I want to leave things clean. So yeah.
He's prepared.
I'm prepared.
He's prepared. Made a will and had it legally signed and good.
I have all my passwords stored in a system, so I can just hand stuff over.
Your wife
good.
is so happy to hear
good.
this.
Yeah, it's good.
Jane, as you look back over all your decades since you were a young woman sitting in the Mongabay, what are some of the changes you've witnessed that you think are just like really positive? Because we tend to focus on the degradation, the deforestation, the things that have gone darkly and badly because of this intellect, because of our greed. What are some real shining lights as you look back over the decades of doing this work and seeing so many situations and so many people?
Well, after I'd been studying the chimpanzees for 2 years, my mentor, Louis Leakey, said I had to go and get a degree at Cambridge University, even though I hadn't been to college. He said we didn't have time for an undergraduate degree. He got me a place to do a PhD. So I was very nervous, if you can imagine. And imagine, I was told I'd done everything wrong. You shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. They're just animals. They should have numbers. And you can't talk about their personality, their mind, or their emotion. Those are characteristics unique to us. Nor must you have empathy, because to be a good scientist, you must be coldly objective. So fortunately, I had this wonderful teacher when I was a child who taught me that in this respect, those professors were totally, completely talking rubbish. And that teacher was my dog, Rusty. You can't have an animal and not know that, of course, we're not the only beings on this planet with personalities, minds, and emotions. So anyway, I got the PhD, but it was the chimpanzees who helped to break down the scientific attitude of 1960 and before, that we were separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. There was a sharp line. And I suppose it was created by religion to start with. I'm not sure, but human arrogance. So, the big positive change is that in country after country, we're getting better laws, better understanding of animals, more people fighting against cruelty in one form or another. That's something very, very positive, and it's still going on today. And, as you said, Rhett, awareness about the environmental problems, that's growing. And with awareness and with youth programs and with young people wanting to make a difference, and the indigenous people that you mentioned, my goodness, they are so courageous and so determined and such amazing guardians of the planet. And so listening to indigenous voices is also something that's relatively recent and is a really, really important good news for us. And, well, those are just some of them. Oh, and women. I should mention, the fact that women around the world are getting, in many countries, a much better. People are listening and accepting that women are as good as men, and sometimes better.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's a story I heard from an indigenous shaman in Latin America. I can't remember which country now, but he said, Jane, we call our tribe an eagle. And this eagle has two wings. One is male and one is female. And we say we will only fly high when those wings are equal.
And on that note, I'd like to thank Jane Goodall, Rhett Butler for joining us here at Climate One on today.
I wish we could see them.
I'd also like to thank the Climate One team and the team here at Sydney Goldstein Theater for making this happen. We get to sit up here in the bright lights. There's a fabulous team. We'd like to give them a round for the ushers, the production team, Jenny and Megan and Brad and Ben, Adam. So we'll see you next time, everybody. You can listen to the podcast. Thanks. One more time.
Yeah.
Should we do the
We're going to do we're going to do a little selfie here.
Yes, I remember.
Let's get, put that hit. Jane, you want to join us?